The mansion's garden was trimmed to perfection, every rosebush lined like soldiers in formation. But on this warm afternoon, the quiet order of wealth was broken by a sound rarely heard here: laughter. A man in a tailored suit, worth more than most families could imagine, froze as he stepped onto the patio. His daughter, his only child, was seated cross-legged on the stone pathway. She wasn't playing with the golden trinkets he bought her, or scrolling through the latest gadgets. No. She was bent over a piece of torn cardboard, scribbling words and numbers, her face lit up with joy. Beside her sat a girl in tattered clothes, a child whose hair was unwashed, her sneakers ripped at the seams, her eyes carrying both hunger and wisdom. The billionaire's face shifted quickly: confusion, disbelief, then anger. His fists clenched as he demanded answers. What happens when the richest man in town discovers his daughter secretly learning from a girl who has nothing? What could she possibly gain from someone who sleeps on sidewalks, someone society barely notices? But in that moment, the daughter's smile told a story that no amount of private tutors or expensive schools could erase. What he did next shocked not just his family, not just his town, but the entire nation. And yet, this wasn't a chance encounter. This was the beginning of a story that would expose secrets no amount of money could hide. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. The billionaire was a man whose name commanded respect in boardrooms and fear in negotiations. He built his empire from steel and concrete, yet in his private life he constructed walls far higher than any building he owned. Every move he made was calculated, every smile rehearsed. To him, reputation was more valuable than gold, and control was the glue that held his world together. He had invested millions into ensuring his family mirrored the perfect image of success: the right schools, the right charities, the right appearances at glittering galas. But beneath the surface of polished photographs and carefully staged interviews, his household carried a silence money could not break. His daughter was the center of his life, yet she was also the most carefully hidden piece of his empire, protected, pampered, and unknowingly imprisoned by the weight of her father's expectations. The daughter was unlike the photographs in glossy magazines. Behind her designer clothes and chauffeur-driven rides, she carried an ache few could see. Her friends were chosen for her days mapped out like business deals, yet the one thing she longed for, genuine connection, was never scheduled. That is why the laughter in the garden that afternoon mattered so deeply. For the first time, she wasn't pretending. She wasn't playing the role of the daughter of a billionaire. She was just a girl, curious and alive, sketching words and ideas on cardboard with someone the world would dismiss without a second glance. In the torn edges of that cardboard, she found more meaning than in all the textbooks stacked in her gilded study. And sitting across from her was the one who made this possible, a girl who had nothing, yet carried a spark the wealthy could never purchase. The homeless girl was unlike any stranger you might pass on a busy street. Her clothes were worn, her skin bore the marks of cold nights spent without shelter, but her eyes carried something rare. They were sharp, observant, filled with an intelligence born not of privilege but of survival. She taught not with arrogance but with patience, using scraps of cardboard as her chalkboard and memory as her textbook. She asked no questions about the mansion she sat in front of. She seemed more interested in sharing what she knew, phrases, ideas, lessons that sounded like they belonged to someone who had once studied, once dreamed. But who was she really? Where had she come from? And why did she speak as though she carried knowledge far beyond her years? One thing was certain. Her presence was about to test the billionaire's most fragile possession, his reputation. Because if the world discovered that his daughter was secretly learning from a homeless girl, it wouldn't just raise eyebrows. It would unravel the carefully woven image he had built for decades. But who really was this girl? And why was she teaching lessons no elite school ever had? That evening, the billionaire's voice thundered through the marble halls of his mansion. His daughter stood small before him, her hands trembling as he forbade her from ever speaking to the girl again. To him, it wasn't about friendship. It was about scandal. What would the board members say if photographs leaked of his daughter, heir to his empire, sitting on the ground with a girl in rags? To him, reputation was survival. To her, the homeless girl was the first person who had ever seen her without the masks of wealth. Tears welled in her eyes as she listened to her father's command, but behind her silence was something stronger than obedience: resolve. That night, as the mansion lights dimmed, she made her choice. For the first time in her life, she was ready to break the rules that had kept her caged. The next afternoon, with her father occupied in meetings, she slipped out through the back gates of the estate. She walked quickly, heart racing, until she reached a worn park bench where the homeless girl waited. The girl's smile wasn't surprised. It was knowing, as though she understood rebellion carried its own kind of freedom. On that bench, the lessons continued. But they weren't about textbooks or polished speeches. The girl taught her resilience, explaining how to stretch a single meal across 2 days, how to budget coins like treasures, how to survive when the world pretends you don't exist. The billionaire's daughter listened with rapt attention, realizing that what this girl offered wasn't just knowledge, it was truth. It was survival in its rawest form, the kind of wisdom no private tutor could ever teach. For the first time she felt alive in the company of someone who owed her nothing. But secrets do not stay hidden in the world of the powerful. The billionaire, consumed by suspicion, took matters into his own hands. He hired private investigators, determined to uncover who this girl truly was and why she had entered his daughter's world. Night after night, files were compiled, photographs taken, questions whispered on cold streets. The daughter had no idea her every movement was being tracked, nor that her new friend was under scrutiny from men with cameras and notepads. To her, the friendship was a lifeline. To her father, it was a potential disaster. And then, the reports came back, the photographs, the documents, the story of who this girl really was. And when the billionaire saw the truth laid bare before him, it wasn't scandal that terrified him most. It was something far darker, something that no amount of money could bury. But when the results came back, the truth was darker than anyone expected. The investigators' reports painted a story that was difficult to reconcile with the girl's present condition. She had not always lived on the streets. Once, she had been one of the brightest students at a local public school. Teachers described her as gifted, curious, and determined, the kind of student who stayed after class to ask questions and borrow books others ignored. Her future seemed bound for college scholarships and opportunities her family had never known. But then the collapse came. Her father's modest job had tied their savings to a corporation's stock program, a corporation owned by the billionaire himself. When fraud was uncovered within that company, employees lost everything. Families were left with no safety net, and hers was among them. Overnight, stability turned into desperation. And as bills piled higher, their home slipped from their hands. The eviction was brutal, swift, and unforgettable. Their belongings, clothes, photographs, toys, were tossed onto the sidewalk as neighbors watched in silence. Her mother's health, already fragile, began to unravel under the weight of stress and untreated illness. Doctor visits became a luxury they couldn't afford, medicine a dream just out of reach. And so the girl, once praised for her intelligence, found herself facing nights of hunger and mornings of cold pavement. She learned to calculate survival not by equations on paper, but by counting coins in her pocket, by deciding which meal to skip, which corner felt safest to sleep. The laughter of classmates was replaced by the echo of footsteps passing her by, people too busy to notice a child slipping into shadows. It was in those shadows she hardened, not into bitterness, but into resilience. She carried her lessons like armor, determined never to be broken. As the billionaire's daughter listened to these fragments of memory on that worn park bench, she felt a knot tighten in her chest. Her entire world had been built on the illusion of fairness, of success rewarded and failure deserved. But here was proof that life could destroy the innocent while protecting the powerful. The cardboard lessons weren't just about coins or budgeting. They were about injustice, about survival in a world designed to overlook those who fall. The daughter's questions grew sharper, her curiosity unshakable. How could someone so intelligent, so capable, be reduced to the margins of society? And how could her own father, who boasted of charity and progress, be so blind to the consequences of his empire? The answers wouldn't come easily, for even as she struggled to comprehend her friend's pain, her father's investigators continued to dig. But the deeper he dug, the more one chilling connection kept surfacing. The report sat heavy on the billionaire's desk, its pages filled with records that cut deeper than any financial loss ever could. The investigators had traced the girl's past to her father, a man who once walked the very halls of the billionaire's company. He had been a loyal employee, a man who believed in the promises of opportunity and growth. But years earlier, when profits were slipping, the billionaire made a ruthless decision. Entire departments were gutted, jobs erased with the stroke of a pen, and lives dismantled in the process. Among those casualties was the girl's father. He lost his career, his savings, his dignity. The decision that seemed like just another business move at the time had destroyed an entire family. The billionaire's empire, the very foundation of his wealth, had been built in part on the ruin of the man whose daughter now sat in his garden. The revelation struck him with a force greater than any competitor's blow. His face tightened as he stared at the photographs clipped to the file, the homeless girl smiling faintly on a park bench, her resemblance to the man he had once dismissed unmistakable. Suddenly, the laughter he had overheard in his garden took on a haunting echo. This wasn't fate playing a cruel trick. This was history demanding an answer. For years he had convinced himself his decisions were necessary, that sacrifices had to be made for progress. But now, that sacrifice had a face, a name, and a voice that was teaching his daughter truths no elite education ever had. And in that crushing moment of realization, the walls of his empire felt less like fortresses and more like chains, binding him to choices he could no longer defend. The twist was undeniable. He realized the child teaching his daughter was the daughter of the man whose life he destroyed. His breath caught, his chest heavy with the weight of it. For the first time, control slipped from his grasp. The image he had so carefully curated for decades, the flawless CEO, the untouchable figure of success, now felt like a mask hiding a thief of futures. His daughter had unknowingly befriended the living reminder of his darkest decision, and now he stood at a crossroads, haunted by a dilemma that no wealth could resolve. Should he confess, risk his empire and his reputation by admitting the truth of what he had done? Or should he bury the past once more, even if it meant silencing the only friendship that had ever brought his daughter joy? The choice loomed before him, and either path promised consequences he could never escape. The mansion, once a sanctuary of control, became a place of unrest. Late one evening, the daughter stood hidden behind the half-closed study door, her breath shallow as she overheard her father's strained voice on the phone. Words like ruined, past decisions, and the girl slipped through the cracks. She pieced together fragments of a truth he had never intended her to hear. When she confronted him, her voice trembled, but carried a sharpness he had never faced from her before. "Did you destroy her family?" she asked, tears welling in her eyes. For once, the billionaire, who always had an answer, always had a plan, could not find the words. His silence was an answer louder than any confession. It shattered something between them, a trust that even wealth could not mend. From that night on, the daughter's loyalty no longer belonged to the empire her father built, but to the friend her father had wronged. Beyond the gates of his estate, whispers began to stir. A few photographs of the homeless girl with the billionaire's daughter surfaced online, posted by passers-by who had noticed their unusual friendship. What began as curiosity quickly grew into speculation. Comment threads buzzed with questions. Who was this girl? Why was the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the country sitting on a park bench with her? Rumors swelled, and soon bloggers and small news outlets were digging deeper. His empire, once untouchable, began to feel the cracks of public scrutiny. Board members grew restless, investors uneasy. Each whisper of the girl's story threatened to expose the choices he had buried for years. For the first time, his wealth wasn't enough to silence the voices rising online. And as the narrative spread, it wasn't the billionaire being praised, it was the girl. The homeless girl became more than just a child living on the margins. She became a symbol, her resilience shining brighter than the wealth stacked against her. To the public, she was a reminder that strength was not found in skyscrapers or luxury cars, but in surviving the streets with dignity and tact. The daughter, once timid and sheltered, now spoke boldly in her defense. At charity events, at school, even in front of her father's colleagues, she refused to hide the truth of their friendship. Every word she spoke cut deeper into the armor her father had worn for decades. Pride and guilt collided within him. Pride in the empire he had built, guilt for the lives it had crushed. His daughter's defiance left him cornered, unable to decide whether to silence her or protect her. And then, just when he thought things couldn't get worse, an unexpected visitor arrived at his door. The knock at the mansion door was soft, almost hesitant, but it carried a weight that made the servants pause before answering. Standing there was a frail woman, her shoulders hunched beneath a worn shawl, her face pale from years of illness. It was the homeless girl's mother. She had come not with threats, not with lawyers, but with the quiet strength of someone who had nothing left to lose. When she stepped into the grand entryway, her presence seemed almost out of place among the chandeliers and marble floors. Yet her eyes, tired but resolute, fixed on the billionaire with a force that stripped him of all his practiced authority. For the first time in years, he felt small in his own home. The daughter rushed to the woman's side, holding her arm as though guiding royalty into the room. The air thickened, silence wrapping around them like a judgment waiting to be spoken. The confrontation began not with shouts, but with a voice weakened by illness, carrying more power than any raised tone ever could. "You don't remember me, do you?" she asked, her words trembling but steady. The billionaire's eyes narrowed, recognition flickering and then hardening. She continued, "My husband gave your company 20 years of his life. He believed in you, and with a single decision, you left him with nothing. You built these walls on the ashes of our home." The words cut deeper than any headline, each syllable dragging ghosts from the past into the present. The daughter looked between them, horrified, as the truth she had overheard now stood undeniable, embodied in the fragile woman before her. The billionaire tried to defend himself, to say it was business, necessary for survival. But his voice faltered under the weight of her stare. No calculation, no polished excuse could erase what had been done. Tears welled in the daughter's eyes as she turned to her father. "This isn't just business," she whispered, her voice cracking. "This is their lives, her life, and hers," she said, pointing toward her friend. The billionaire's jaw tightened, pride battling the cracks of guilt spreading inside him. His entire empire, his name, his image, all of it depended on silence, on control, on burying the past. Yet here, in his own home, the past stood before him with skin, bone, and truth. The daughter's voice grew louder now, steady with conviction. "You always told me reputation matters more than anything, but today I'm asking you, what matters more to you? Your empire or compassion?" The words rang in his ears like a verdict, stripping away every shield he had built. And for the first time in decades, the billionaire had to make a decision not with his wallet, but with his heart. In the days that followed, whispers turned into headlines. But instead of denying the accusations or hiding behind his wealth, The billionaire did something no one expected. Standing before cameras, investors, and critics, he lowered his gaze and admitted the truth. He confessed that his empire had been built not only on ambition, but on ruthless decisions that had destroyed lives along the way. And then, he named one of those lives. He spoke of the man he had ruined, the family that had suffered, and the young girl who now symbolized a resilience stronger than his fortune. The words shook the city, but not with scandal, with humanity. For the first time in his career, he had chosen humility over pride, and in that humility, a transformation began, not of his empire, but of himself. He pledged to use his wealth not as a shield, but as a means to restore what had been lost. True to his word, he arranged the best medical care for the frail mother who had stood in his doorway, ensuring she would no longer suffer alone. He set up a trust to guarantee the homeless girl's education, not as charity, but as a recognition of her brilliance and determination. He spoke openly about his wrongdoing, not to erase the past, but to acknowledge it. For his daughter, these actions became more than restitution. They were proof that change, however late, was possible. She watched as her father, once the cold architect of control, began to soften in the presence of those he had once overlooked. It wasn't an overnight redemption. It was the beginning of a long journey toward something better, a reminder that power wasn't in silencing the weak, but in listening to them. And for the first time in years, the mansion didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a home. One afternoon, the billionaire found himself seated not at a boardroom table, but on the same weathered park bench where his daughter had first defied him. This time, it was the homeless girl, no longer just a shadow of the streets, but a student with dreams, who spoke. She told him about her hope of becoming a teacher, of standing in classrooms where children like her once sat, and showing them that their worth was never defined by wealth. He listened intently, not as a businessman, not as a father protecting his image, but as a man finally humbled by truth. The cardboard that once carried her lessons was gone, but the wisdom remained. And as she spoke, he realized something that had escaped him his entire life. For once, he wasn't the teacher. He was the student. In the end, the story was not just about wealth or poverty, but about what happens when those two worlds collide. The billionaire had spent a lifetime believing that money was the answer to every question, that reputation was the shield against every threat. Yet it was a girl with nothing but cardboard and courage who taught his daughter, and through her taught him, that wisdom doesn't come from power, but from pain. Pride had built his empire, but compassion now threatened to reshape it. His transformation was not measured in dollars spent or promises made, but in the quiet act of listening, of allowing himself to feel the very humanity he had ignored for decades. And still, as the city debated his actions, one truth remained. Sometimes the poorest voices carry the richest lessons. Through it all, his daughter remained the bridge between two worlds, the sheltered halls of privilege and the harsh sidewalks of survival. Her innocence had been the spark that drew them together, her defiance the force that refused to let injustice stay hidden. Without her, the walls would never have cracked, the truths never revealed. She stood as a reminder that compassion often comes not from power, but from the purity of those who refuse to accept cruelty as normal. Yet as the billionaire looked at his daughter's smile, at the girl's determination, and at the fragile hope rising within himself, another question lingered, a question that would follow him long after the headlines faded. Was this redemption, or just a billionaire's way of buying peace? That question was left unanswered, and perhaps it was meant to be, because the line between genuine change and convenient absolution is never clear. Some saw him as a man finally humbled, others as a strategist protecting his empire in a different way. But maybe the truth lay not in his reputation, but in the lives now given a second chance. What do you believe? Was this the beginning of redemption, or simply a carefully purchased peace? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. This story reminds us that sometimes the greatest lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. A man who thought he had everything discovered that true wisdom could be found in a girl society overlooked. A daughter who once lived in shadows of wealth became the light that forced truth into the open, and a family broken by injustice showed the world that dignity can outlast even the harshest of trials. But in the end, the questions remain. Questions only you can answer. What would you have done if you were in the billionaire's shoes? Was this redemption or reputation management? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if this story touched you, please hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the stories we share every week. Until next time, remember, the richest lessons often come from the humblest of places.